time to be the right one. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, the organizer, for this conference. Thank you, Rebecca, for the vision behind the conference. I think that it's important to gather those who are working on environmental issues from different perspectives, with different tools, different approaches, and try to talk about what we know, what we learn, and how we can address the problems and challenges that environmental issues, and in particular climate issues, are addressing to our societies. I'm going to talk about green finance and green and climate finance, probably because we are in Carlo and in this place, finance and building on these other two sectors where people make money, and it's probably interesting to understand that even with climate, we need the talent of those working in the banking and financial sector to solve many of the problems we have in front of us. But let me explain why I believe that finance is the key to address the future of climate policy, of climate negotiations, and all the interventions and measures that we must implement in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet the targets defined in the Paris Agreements 2 years ago. The Paris Agreement has been quite clear, quite ambitious, certainly more ambitious than previous international agreements, by recognizing that there is a threat for humankind that we must face, and we must take measures as soon as possible. And these measures should prevent temperature to increase by more than 2 degrees and possibly no more than 1.5 degrees. And keep in mind that 1 degree is already there, because temperature has already increased by 1 degree with respect to pre-industrial levels, and therefore we have just no more than 1 additional degree, or no more than 1/2 degree in front of us by the end of the century, which is a very difficult challenge, and it's quite difficult to meet this target. But the Paris Agreement has other innovative features. One is, for the first time, it has been signed by all countries in the world. There is now only one reluctant country, but all the other ones seem to be convinced that this is the right approach, even because it's a bottom-up approach in which all countries identify their own policy measures, their own domestic targets, and makes it easier to achieve an agreement. And indeed, for the first time in Paris, under the same roof, there was the largest number of head of state ever experienced in the history of humanity. Certainly a big achievement, even though what the Paris Agreement is able to deliver is still largely insufficient. There is a second, among the many innovative features of the Paris Agreement, that I would like to underline, which is the role of finance. In the agreement, it is explicitly mentioned that finance is a key component of the future steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because we need to finance investments, all the investments that are required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a way which is consistent with the 2-degree target or with the 1-degree target. So what is this? How can the 2-degree target be achieved, and what are the emission pathways, the investments, the technology development which are consistent with this objective? And let me start with this picture. This has been released 10 days ago by UNEP in a report called Emission Gap, and it shows here emissions at the baseline. Here, emissions in the Paris Agreement, and as you can see, emissions have been growing for the last 40, 50 years. In reality, we've been emitting in the last 40 years more than in any previous historical period. And we have been emitting more since we've been talking and discussing about climate change since Rio 92 than in previous centuries, as if the more we talk and negotiate, the more we emit. And this kind of bizarre correlation should be probably understood by negotiators and head of states that notwithstanding the many efforts, are unable to stop emissions from increasing. So emissions are growing. The Paris Agreement will be able to stabilize emissions, more or less. You see here, this is the range of emissions under the Paris Agreements, and you see that emissions will be stabilized, but certainly will not decline. And we need emissions to go to zero, almost zero, by mid-century if we want to keep temperature increase below 2 degrees. So it's a first step. We'll be able for the first time in history to stabilize emissions, but certainly not sufficient to reduce emissions as much as we need. These are the trajectories which are consistent with the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree. And as you see, they're quite different. I mean, this is the Paris Agreement. These are the trajectories by 2030 that are consistent with the 1.5 and 2 degree objectives. If we expand this picture and we consider the 2050 timeline, then you can see that the decline of emissions is even sharper, and we know that we need to be able to develop those technologies, those economic and policy measures, those investments that enable our society to reduce emissions in a very drastic way. Otherwise, it will be impossible to keep temperature increase below 2 degrees. We will adapt, probably, we hope to be able to adapt to the temperature level that will be probably 2 or 3 degrees more than larger than what we experience today. But it's a risk. I don't think that we have the capacity to establish the risk that we are running in this kind of situation, because this is the first time in humanity that we experience a situation in which greenhouse gas concentrations have reached the value that we have now. I mean, we have probably noticed in the newspapers in these last days that concentrations achieved 403 parts per million by volume, and 403 is large, is 30% larger than any value observed in human history, and even before, in the last million years. So these are the trajectories consistent with the 1.2 and the 2 degree target, and this is what the Paris Agreement is going to deliver, and we need to do much more. That's why the report is called the emission gap, because this is the gap, the emission gap, that we should be able to fill in the next decades. If we move to another report, this has been produced by IASA, which is an international organization based in Luxembourg, in Vienna. And again, the story is similar. You see that we need to reduce emission, and these emission reductions must be quite sharp between 2030 and 2050, simply because between now and 2030, emission, in the best case, will be stabilized and not reduced. But there is another important information in this picture, which is here. You see that in this area, beyond 2055, emissions will become negative. What does negative emissions mean? It means that we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It will not be sufficient to reduce emissions to zero. So completely decarbonize our economy, electrify all what is possible to electrify, then produce electricity with renewables and no more with fossil fuels. That will not be sufficient. We need to remove the CO2 that's been emitted in the past, which is in the atmosphere, and which will remain in the atmosphere for 100, 150, 200 years, and that's why we must find out how to do it. We don't have the technology yet, at least not for large-scale CO2 removal, just for some interesting but small experiments are able to show how we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but we need much more. But as you can see here, this is crucial. I mean, if we are unable to remove large quantities of CO2 from the atmosphere, it will be impossible to achieve the 2-degree target, and even worse, it will be even more difficult to achieve the 1.5-degree target. So, we need, first of all, technological innovation. If we don't develop the technologies that have the capacity to, on the one hand, decarbonize the economy, and on the other hand, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, it will be impossible to achieve the 1.5 and 2-degree target. So, first of all, full decarbonization. In this process, renewables are crucial. Renewables suffer from the intermittency problem. In order to solve the intermittency problem, we need to have a storage device, large-scale storage device, because as you know, when there is no sun or no wind, renewables don't produce electricity, but they produce excess electricity when there is sun and wind. So the trick is simple. We need to store electricity when there is an excess production and use it when there is no sun or wind. But unfortunately, we have no good technologies to store electricity, at least at large scale. Again, we are developing the batteries. There are nice experiments. Tesla has recently built to power large-scale power plants. They have the storage technologies, but still we are far from possessing the solution to this problem. In Germany, for example, they built 3 new hydro plants to pump water in the basin and then let water down when they need to produce electricity. So they pump it with renewables and they let it down to produce electricity where renewables are not available. In Switzerland, they do the same with gas. They store high-pressure gas in caves, and then when they need electricity, let the gas out. But this is quite primitive. I mean, it seems the technologies that we have been used for 1,000 years, whereas we need something completely new to store large amount of electricity and enable renewables to cover the full amount of electricity production that humankind will need in the future, and this will be an increasing amount because population increase and GDP increase and so on and so forth. The other technology development which is crucial, as I said, is CO2 removal. Again, there are innovations. As I mentioned, there are a few plants, a couple of them in California, for example. They are able to remove CO2 and reuse the CO2 to produce biofuels or to produce plastic components. But again, this is very energy intensive. You need to produce this energy by using renewables, and then the product can be used for industrial purposes, but the cost is still quite large. So we need to work on cost reduction, otherwise this technology cannot be operational. So technology development is first. Second is finance. Finance, because if we succeed in developing these technologies, if we succeed in having devices, measures, infrastructures that can reduce emissions, then we need to invest in order to diffuse these technologies and these infrastructure all around the world, in particular in developing countries. So what we need is a large investment in both mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means emission reductions. Adaptation means adapt our economic system, socio-economic system to the changing climate. We need these investments, and resources are not yet available, and the effort is really to understand how to achieve the required amount of investments. What is it? There's been a recent series of studies on this issue. I'm summarizing here what has been published in chapter 16 of the last IPCC assessment report. For the first time after 20 years, the IPCC decided to devote a chapter to finance, and this chapter has some interesting numbers that I can show here. We need let's focus on 2030, because 2030 is the timeline of the Paris Agreement. We need about 100 billion US dollar per year on power generation. We need about 600 US dollar per year on energy efficiency. There is a lot to do on energy efficiency, a lot of available low-cost technologies that need to be implemented all over the world. And we need more investments also in research and development. Again, let me give you a number. In the 80s, the investment on research and development in the energy sector was about 0.08% of global GDP. Now it's 1/4, it's 0.02% of global GDP. This is another of the paradox that it's quite difficult to understand. On the one hand, emissions are increasing, we are negotiating a lot, and emissions don't go down. On the other hand, we know that we need technological developments, technological innovation, and investments in energy R&D are decreasing, particularly the public ones, are decreasing over time, and now it's just 1/4 than what they were in the 80s. So the total effort that has been estimated by the IPCC is about $750 billion per year of investments in both mitigation and adaptation, particularly in mitigation. As you can see, these are investments in mitigation. So how to fill the financing gap? How do we find these 700 billion per year? There are many ways. The easiest, the most obvious one is carbon pricing. If we're able to set the price for carbon, companies, households pay the carbon price for all emissions they produce, will give governments financial resources to be spent on investments to reduce emissions. There are some regions in the world where carbon pricing has already been implemented. Europe is one of them, California is another one, and the eastern states of the United States is another example. China is implementing carbon pricing already in some region. Next year it will be a global plan for carbon pricing in all China. Unfortunately, the solutions adopted in most cases, Europe in particular, are not really satisfactory. In particular, in Europe, there is an emission market. Companies producing emissions beyond a given level must buy the permit to produce emissions, so they pay a carbon price. But all the other emission rights are given for free rather than being auctioned, which implies that most of the polluting activities takes place without being charged, without paying for the emissions they produce. And this is certainly a weakness of the European system and all the other systems as well, where the auction share of emission is too small. On the other hand, there was the economic crisis, the economic recessions, and what happened is that the demand for these permits was too low with respect to supply. The price fell down. The price is now about €5 per ton of carbon and €5 per ton of carbon. It was 20-25 when the market started. Now it's about 5, and of course at this level there is no chance to change the choices of companies or households in particular companies, because the system for the moment applies only to large energy installation. There is no way to change their own decision because the relative price is changed just a little bit. So it's quite ineffective as an instrument, and in addition it doesn't raise enough money, because by giving permits for free, the governments are not able to raise the money with which they could fund investments to reduce emissions. So it's not really working well, but it's probably another big mistake. The decision about the supply of permits has been given to the European Parliament. So what happened, for example, is that when the recession implied a fall of demand for permit, an obvious decision of any authority, think of what the central bank does for other kind of assets, would have been to reduce supply. It would have been easy. Reducing supply, the price would have gone up, and the incentive to reduce emission would have been there. But the Parliament took 3 years before deciding to reduce supply. And of course, when it happened, it was too late. And even the decision was not to reduce supply, but postpone the supply of permits. And of course, companies are far-sighted, and they understand that they would get the permits in 4 or 5 years, and they don't increase the demand now. They would just wait for when the permits will be available. So the whole system doesn't seem to work because of governance issues, and because of policy decisions that are not in favor of carbon pricing. The IPCC has been simulating what would be an optimal pricing for carbon, both in terms of effectiveness in modifying decisions, investments, and production decisions, and in terms of resource allocation, in particular resources for R&D or resources for mitigation. And I'll give you quickly information about it. The source are all the 1,000 scenarios produced by IPCC, and here you have some numbers, and you can see this is the optimal price, what carbon prices should be if we want to achieve the 2-degree target. And you see that these are increasing level. This is the first best scenario where, according to IPCC, everything works perfectly. All the other ones are scenarios with second best outcome, but as you can see, the prices are increasing over time. They started about 20, 30 euros per ton of carbon, and then they increase over time. And why do they increase over time? Because the emission reductions become more and more difficult over time, because the first one are cheap, but when we are left with a few emissions, it's going to be difficult, so the incentive must be higher. But these numbers are very far, very distant, very different from those I was mentioning before. We have a market with a price which is €5 per ton of carbon. This is more or less the price in all these markets. The Japan market is even funny, because the Chinese market, because the Chinese government checked for the compliance with the target once a year. So you can see that a few days before the compliance day, there is a huge demand for permits, and the price goes up. And immediately the day after, no one wants permit for the subsequent year, and the price collapses to almost zero, and every year it goes the same way. It is just both to comply with the authority that 1 day per year check whether the companies meet the requirements, which is of course very, very ineffective. And the Chinese government, of course, knows about this. They're going to change the system, but for the moment, this is the situation. So this is very, very inefficient, but also in terms of resources, in terms of investment, because even if we auction all permits, at the moment they cover sectors, about 57% of the sectors of the economy. Even if these sectors, which are covered for the moment by this carbon pricing scheme, pay for the emissions, because permits are not grandfathered, but they are auctioned, then the resource in Europe would be only 17 billions, which is not enough, given the numbers, the 750 that was given before. The share of Europe would be about 80, 90 billions over the 750. 17 over 17, 80 billions is still a small amount. So another important reform would be to cover all sectors, not just those that are covered, that are called ETS sector, covered by the carbon pricing scheme now, but also all the other ones. But again, would be a big reform that is far, far away from being implemented, even in Europe, even in a region where the climate change problem is perceived as quite important. Another strategy is to reallocate portfolios, the private sector, so not the a public intervention with a carbon pricing, but the public sector that's moving, and it's moving because it finds it interesting in terms of returns to move into the right direction. And this is actually what has been happening in the last years. On average, about 400 billions have been invested either in mitigation or in adaptation, most of it in mitigation, as we will see, and a large share of these investments come from the private sectors in different ways. I mean, by reallocating portfolio of investment funds, by redirecting existing investments into a more climate-friendly investment, so with a more climate-friendly approach or strategy, by developing new public-private sector partnerships. There have been many ideas that have been proposed recently with results that I'm now going to show that may lead to some optimism in terms of future development. This is, for example, what happened in terms of total investment. As you can see, on average in the last 3 years, it is 400 billions that you can see, where private actors are funding for about 250 to 170, and all the rest is from public actors. If you remember, the so-called Green Climate Fund, again, decided in Copenhagen in 2009, but then confirmed and reassessed in Paris 2 years ago, and then funded by states for about 60%. We have been able to collect about 60 billion over the 100. That was the commitment in Paris. It's much smaller, much smaller than the 400 that have been invested, even independently of the so-called Green Climate Fund. So markets are moving on their own, without waiting for governments to decide, without waiting for incentives or subsidies, even though incentives like carbon pricing, carbon taxation would be quite helpful, but even without that, the private markets are moving into the right direction by investing in mitigation, in emission reductions. Other information about these investments here, you can see that large share are national investments, even though it's changing, because multilateral investments, the Asian Development Bank or the European Investment Bank, I mean multilateral institutions, or the World Bank that are supporting these kind of investments. The share of multilateral is increasing, but still most of the resources come at the national level. I mean, the domestic investments are the large share of these investments. As you can see here, in terms of private sources, most of the largest fraction is comes from project developers. Corporate actors, that mean companies, private companies, are investing more than households or banks or financial institutions, which means that most resources come from the company's balance sheet. They make profits, and they use these profits to invest into these new directions, in particular in power plants, renewable power plants, because there is an interest in return. They make a profit out of these investments. Banks, I mean, the traditional financial channels are lagging behind, they are late. They are coming now because you see there's been a sharp increase in investment from commercial financial institutions from 21 in 2012 to 55 in 2016, so big increase, but they are coming now a little bit later than companies' investments. What kind of instruments? Again, you get here the confirmation that the balance sheet finance is first, so profits from companies. Project debt is also a major innovation from 17 to 127. What's project debt? A company has a clear project and goes to the market and emits, say, bonds to get the money to finance that project. As we will see, this is a very promising way, and households, private citizens are quite in favor of lending money to companies if they are guaranteed that the money is invested into a climate-friendly strategy, or in a climate-friendly way, or at least in a way that does not imply fossil fuel companies' involvement or resources. So as you can see, balance sheet, then project debt, and then equity, even though equity is still a minor component. As I said, most funding come from the private sector. From this slide is just simply a summary of what I was saying before. Most funding come from the private sector, and this funding comes first from companies' own resource, and now there is a movement to go to the financial sector, in particular to banks and financial actors, to find the resources to be able to start these investments. As I said before, most of it go to mitigation. Mitigation is production of electricity with power plants, emission reductions, because say coal power plants or oil or gas power plants are replaced with renewables. It's energy efficiency, and it has been mostly renewables for the last year. In 2016 there has been a change, and a lot of resources have been invested into energy efficiency plants. Again, this reflects technology development. There has been a lot of innovation to energy efficiency, and the resources have been moving to that direction because technology led the direction of these investments. But still, of course, a lot can be done in terms of production of electricity. The share of renewables at the global level is just 10%. It's 20% in Europe, and we need much more. We need to go to 20% by 2020, and in Europe it will be 27%, and then it will grow up in the future. So there is still a lot to do, but the investments seem to be into the right direction. Why is it that investment on adaptation are still quite limited? But the reason is the return on this investment. Investment on adaptation are mostly investment in infrastructure, say dikes to protect banks from sea level, or maintenance of the territory to prevent flooding to produce disasters. There are some investment in adaptation when you think of agriculture. Droughts are a problem. Climate change has one of the implications, the most dangerous implication are droughts, and droughts can be fought through irrigation. New irrigation systems are available, and there's some investment into that direction. So most of the investment into adaptation are investment in the agriculture sector, in particular into irrigation systems. As you can see, the investments move into mitigation, and this slide shows you that in 2014 it was mostly renewable power plants and then energy efficiency. Last year, 2015-16, the situation has been different. Most resources went to energy efficiency, 39%, and immediately after there were resources invested in renewable energy production. Sustainable transport is becoming a major attractor of investments, because electricity cars, because biofuels, and because many other things are coming out. Again, technology is driving a change. So it's interesting to see that anytime technology produces low-cost options, the return for this kind of investment increases, and a lot of investors move into that sector because they know that their own money invested into that sector will be able to produce both an environmental friendly outcome, emission reductions, and at the same time an economically interesting outcome in terms of profits and return. This is what's happening both on energy efficiency, on renewables, and on sustainable transport. The price today, there have been recently auctions of electricity in which electricity produced with renewables has been sold at 3 cents per kilowatt, whereas fossil fuels power plants are unable to deliver electricity at less than 6 cents per kilowatt. So, of course, 3 cents is still an exception, but on average, renewables are able to produce electricity at about 5-6 cents per kilowatt, and they are certainly competitive with fossil fuel sources in Europe. Not completely yet in the United States because of shale gas production, but certainly they will soon be competitive even in the United States and in the developing world even more. So it's a matter of sending the right signals to the private sector to be able to develop the right technologies, and then the investment will move into the right direction. As I said, adaptation is still a minor component of these investments, and this slide just shows what I was saying before. Most of the investments in adaptation go to waste and water management. Certainly, water is a scarce resource, at least until we are able to develop a desalination technology at low cost, which is something that may happen. This year at the University of Manchester in the UK, they developed a membrane with graphene that may be able to deliver desalination at a very low price and solve problems, crucial problems, particularly in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where food production is scarce and water is needed. But again, this is for the future, and in a few years probably we will be able to achieve even this objective. As you see, in 2014, just two numbers, the situation was similar. Again, most resources in adaptation were invested into water management, water availability, and much less in all other fields. And in any case, we are talking about only 7% of total investments, whereas 90% go to mitigation. Another interesting innovation is green bonds. Green bonds have been introduced recently. You will see, I think I have a slide later that shows that green bonds were just non-existent in 2011, 2012, but in the last 4 or 5 years, the share of resources coming from these financial assets has been increasing. What are green bonds? These are bonds. Usually companies are emitting green bonds, but now municipalities are also using green bonds. They clearly state why they are used. So they get the money from the investors, and you commit to use this money only for climate-related initiatives, for example, for the building of a power plant, a renewable power plant. There are some examples, probably the most known one is in France. EDF launched 2 green bond emissions, two quite large green bond emissions, and they were very successful. In a few days, even small investors decide to give EDF the money to build these power plants, because they believe that in addition to the standard market return, there is a social return, an environmental return in terms of lower emissions, and they get a benefit out of it. There is this perception that there is a benefit by lending money for renewable power plants or similar mitigation investments. And green bonds have been designed with this kind of purpose. This is the information I was mentioning before. So you can see 2011-12 green bonds were almost nothing, and in 2016 there are about $80 billion. 80, as if you remember, is about 20% of the total investments, about 400. The total investments have been invested in 2015-2016. And by the way, 400 is about half the 750 that would be optimal to invest. And again, this is about only one-tenth of the total investments every year carried out in cities or in companies per infrastructure, to develop infrastructure. Think about investments in power plants, investments in roads, in buildings. All these investments could be modified by taking into account the implications on climate change. And what we need is to devote only 1/10 of these investments that take place every year into the right direction. Green bonds cover 8 billion, which is 20% of the existing investments in mitigation. So sharp rise of green bonds. This is the good news. In which sector? It should be obvious, given what I've been saying in the last half an hour. It is the sector is the energy sector more than any other one, simply because most resources go to renewable electricity production. Where, in which areas, and for which sector? But most of it is in developed countries, so we need to do a lot even in developing countries. But unfortunately, in developing countries, most of the investments come either from public sources or multilateral institutions like the World Bank or other kind of international financial organizations. So a lot can be done in these countries with probably a different strategy, which is the one of de-risking or reducing the risk of the investment in these countries. So, governments don't need to give or devote resources to developing countries, but they just need to reduce the risk for investors from developed countries when they invest in developing countries. Is something which is done normally for many kind of exports and should be probably done more precisely for investments in climate-related or mitigation investments. Let me make an example. There is a recent one in which private investor in renewable energy production in Mexico had been supported by the Norwegian sovereign fund that doesn't provide resources for the investment, but provides an insurance mechanism that guarantees a regular flow of revenues for the first 5 years in order to give investor the certainty of the flow of revenue, the certainty of the return on investment, and then they move into the direction of investing in renewable energy production with this kind of support that may not be costly, because if the flow of revenue is regular anyway, the Norwegian sovereign fund will not spend any money. But if there is an unexpected event, they will cover the risk by paying for the insurance scheme specifically designed for this kind of investment. So there are innovation in finance that can be quite helpful, both in terms of providing more incentives and enhance return, or even better, to reduce the risk of this investment. Again, if the return is similar and the risk is similar, investors will move into climate-friendly investments rather than the other ones. In this diagram, you see that municipalities are also using these kind of green bonds, so not only private companies, but also cities. Cities are becoming a major actor to address climate change, much more important than governments. Cities control many of these 7 trillion investments that every year are made in infrastructure. And of course, if they control these investments, they are also the actors that can shift this investment to the right direction. And that's why the issuance green bonds by cities is very important. In terms of region, again, as I told you, most of the investment come from Europe and the Americas, so nothing new here. In terms of technology, the blue and yellow areas shown in this slide are wind and solar. So as you can see, most of the investments go to wind and solar renewable power plants. Right, again, this is obvious for what I said before. This diagram just confirms that this is the direction where investments are going, and this is a good thing because the replacement of fossil fuels with renewables is taking place, but it's still very, very slow, and we need to move faster into this direction. Again, insurance or micro-insurance mechanisms are also very, very important. The refinancing industry is also using green bonds. So what's the refinancing industry? If an insurance company is likely to face a big risk, rather than risking to pay too much money to the insurers when the bad event takes place, they prefer reinsure themselves with another insurance company. These are huge amount of money, and again, green bonds have been used by the reinsurer, by the reinsurance sector, to reduce the risk they face when the bad events, in extreme events, flooding, a hurricane, or whatever, take place, and they have to reimburse the damaged companies or damaged households. So again, these changes are important, but let me conclude by underlining how changes in technologies still drive all these important modifications in our society, in particular in the financial sector. This slide shows you the dynamics of the price of photovoltaic modules in the last 20, 30 years. Let's focus in the last 30 years. As you can see, the sharp fall in the price of photovoltaic modules is the main reason why we have so many investment in renewables, why the price of electricity produced by renewables is now competitive with the other sources, and so on and so forth. And this is the outcome of technological innovation, of technological development. We need this kind of innovation because if this happens, prices of these technologies go down, investments into this technology become profitable, even more profitable than traditional technologies, and we're able to move faster into this transition to a low-carbon economy, which is dramatically needed. Otherwise, the Paris Agreement target, the 2-degree target, will not be achieved, and we don't know whether we will be able to survive in a world with a 3 or 4 degree temperature increase. Let me go back to the numbers. This is the public expenditure on R&D. This is what I was telling you before. It was this level in the 80s, now down to this level. On the right-hand side, you see what models estimate would be consistent, the expenditure in R&D that would be consistent with the 2-degree target. And you can see it's not a unbelievable, irrealistic amount of investments. It would be sufficient to go back to the levels of the 80s. If this kind of research or research and development could attract resources as it attracted in the 80s, we will have enough investments to deliver the technological innovation, even taking into account the uncertainty and so on and so forth, to deliver technological innovation that we need to achieve the 2-degree target. So I'm not concluding or achieving this conclusion because I'm a university professor, but certainly more investments in research, more investment into the university labs and so on and so forth is the first step that will drive all the other ones. Thank you very much. And of course, if you have questions, if you have a couple short questions, I'm here to clarify your doubts in case. Please.
As an economist, do you take into consideration some of the recycling costs of using solar farms and some of the side effects of some of these normally sustainable technologies such as wind farms, side effects of harming seabed for transmission of electricity onshore from HVDC lines? How far does the economic analysis go concerning the eventual decommissioning of solar farms and wind farms and the side effect costs of exploiting these technologies in terms of other environmental negative impacts such as birds and fish?
When we carry out this kind of analysis, we try to take into account all effects, including the one you mentioned, even though there is a lot of uncertainty. So the numbers might be taken with some, be cautious when considering even the numbers that I showed you, because there is a lot of uncertainty behind these numbers, as it is true for many other sciences and research. But why are we doing all this? We are doing all this not just because we want a marginal benefit in terms of using renewables with respect to fossil fuels. We're doing all this because we know that the damages from climate change are going to be large, very large. So if the comparison is made between different fossil sources or different energy sources, there may be some uncertainty. We are almost there, and one may argue by taking into account the effects that you are mentioning, we may have some negative side effects. But if you compare these costs with the benefits of reducing emissions, that is of avoiding climate change, we are talking about huge amount of money, so there is no comparison. So there is no doubt that this is the right direction, even though there are the side negative effects that you mentioned.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. In terms of your time zones, your time frames, technological component with artificial intelligence and with the dispersion of computational capability across more geographical zones, do you see that there might be a chance that perhaps will go down, that will truncate, make shorter the time to objective in achieving technological achievements and developments, leading all the way up to products on markets? Thank you for addressing this in whichever way you can. Thank you.
The answer is yes. This is a field I've been following recently quite a lot. The answer is yes. We can observe major improvements, in particular in developing countries, that will develop in a much faster way than developed one, because they don't have a stock of investment to deplete, and it will be much easier for them to move into a better development path than we do. This has been true in many things. Think of digital payments. Digital payments are really well developed in Europe. It's a bit a shame that no more than 20-25% of total payments are digital. In Kenya, they reach 90% of payments by phone. So they can do it. They need support, in particular financial support. But what you're saying is a major change which has not been taken into account in all this analysis, but is a major change that can modify our future and make the transition much faster. This is what I hope. I don't know what newspaper a couple of days ago mentioned something that I said about the race between technology and climate change. If that kind of technology is able to develop at the pace we have been observing the last year, probably this figure will be soon obsolete and will be able to reach a much faster transition.
Thank you very much. Professor Damiana Bakircieva of University of Monaco. I wanted to check with you, maybe I understood you wrong, but you seemed skeptical about the Tesla gigafactories and their capacity to function well enough. Elon Musk seems to think that just 10 of those would be enough to cover all of the world's need for storing energy.
I'm not skeptical. It's a great outcome, but it's a tiny thing. It's a drop with respect to total energy production. And before expanding that kind of technology at the world level, will take here a lot of investments. Again, it costs money, so we need the resources to do it. And the technology is still too costly. So maybe economies of scale will be there, and the technology will become cheaper and cheaper. But other ones argue that physically that kind of technology will be unable to develop large-scale storage at low price. We need something different. But again, it's a matter of time. I believe that the number of researchers on this issue that are spread all over the world will be able to give us something helpful in terms of storage in a few years. Progress over there is certain and is fast. I'm more skeptical about CO2 removal. CO2 removal is an issue that is more distant in the future. No more questions. Thank you very much, and I wish you a nice afternoon.